Okay, tonight we begin the class then on the Gospel of John. Now, as we go into the introductory material tonight, and that's really all that we're going to cover, is just try to cover the various things, the points of interest about the Gospel of John. And then next week we will get into the text itself and see what it actually says. But as we take a look at this, why we first of all want to say John, the man. Who was he? What do we know about John just as a man? If we wanted to get acquainted with him, we generally start out our classes with this. We take the author and spend some time talking about what kind of a person are they. So what would we know about John if we wanted to study him to see what we could find out about him? Well, no, what we would find out is John was a Jew. We would know that. We would know that he was a Palestinian Jew, as we can see later on. We would understand that he was an eyewitness of the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We know that he's one of the 12 apostles that was chosen by Jesus. And then he was one of the inner circle. Now, in the inner circle, we'll look at it in just a moment, but he was one of the three spatial people. When you think about three apostles that Jesus would call out under different situations and call them away from the other apostles, who comes to your mind? We can just kind of just pick them out, can't we? Peter, James, and John. And he would call them apart. And so that's what we're going to be talking about, the inner circle. So if we looked at it like this, we would say, okay, here is the world. And then out of the whole world, there were certain people who were called disciples. Now, a disciple means a learner, one who is learning after a teacher, trying to imbibe his philosophy, trying to imbibe his attitude, his disposition, his spirit. The rabbis of the Old Testament would have their disciples, and they would choose the man that they looked at as the greatest and the best, and they would follow him around, and they would try to learn what his attitude, his disposition, his teaching, his philosophy. A disciple was something that's different than a student. Here tonight, we would say you are students and I am a teacher. Now, the word rabbi means teacher, but it means more than a teacher. What my job will be to try to impart knowledge. I'll be taking the book and trying to impart knowledge, and you're going to be trying to eat that knowledge so that when I'm gone, it won't make any difference. Your attitude, your disposition is going to come from the word that you've learned. But if you were my disciples, it would mean that you would look upon me as a very special teacher. And you would say, Lowell has a philosophy of life, an attitude, a disposition, a teaching, a doctrine that's very special. And I want to try to follow his teaching, his philosophy there. We see it in such places and such things like as Confucius. People follow Confucius. They're his disciples. They're trying to pattern their life after him. Now, Jesus comes along, and Jesus is a rabbi, and he has his disciples. Now, his disciples are those people that follow him. They say, we want to follow Jesus because he has a very spatial outlook on life. He has a philosophy that he is teaching. He has a disposition, attitude. We want to follow him and try to become like him. That's the idea of a disciple. So really, that's what we're doing in here, isn't it? See, is trying to look at him and say, okay, he now has a certain philosophy. And I use that word because I'm trying to make a point. We always say, well, didn't Jesus teach the Word of God? Well, yeah, but that is a certain philosophy, isn't it? In other words, the philosophy of Jesus was not that Confucius and other prophets and so forth were very important in these worlds. His philosophy was that the Word of God is to be our guide, that He came to show us what God is like, what His teaching is like, and so that really was what we would call or talk about then, his philosophy. And so He had His disciples, His learners then. Now, out of the learners, He picked 12 men. And these 12, of course, we call apostles. Now, what would be the difference between a disciple and apostle? What does apostle mean? When you say apostle, you're speaking a Greek word. And it means one sent forth. So Jesus then, out of all these disciples, He had hundreds of disciples. Out of all these disciples, He chose 12 men and told them that they were going to be His apostles, and He's going to send them forth to be a witness of His death, burial, and resurrection. Now, out of these apostles, Jesus chose 3 special people, and that is Peter, James, and John. Now, it's kind of interesting of why He chose them. I don't know why He chose those 3, but He did choose those 3 men. Evidently, they were close to Him. He was very comfortable around them. They were His special close friends. We can see this in such passages as Matthew 17, when He went up on the Mount of Transfiguration. He took Peter, James, and John with Him up there. Now, lots of questions can come up. Why didn't He take all 12? It wouldn't have been too much of a bother. 12 men on one gigantic mountain. Couldn't He have taken them all? Well, yeah, He could have taken them all everywhere. But He chose to take Peter, James, and John to go up to experience that. Then, when He was in the Garden of Gethsemane, all of His disciples, all of His apostles go out with Him, and then He chose Peter, James, and John. He said, now, you come with me just a little farther. So they then came with Him. He walked on away from the other apostles, walked over, and then He told them, now you wait here while I go into the garden and pray. And so, why did He do that? I don't know. The point I'm making is that these 3 men were very special to Jesus in His life. In Mark 13, there we find in the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, in Matthew 24, we generally think of that. Everybody knows that's the chapter that tells about the destruction of Jerusalem, where His disciples said, Lord, look at this building, how gigantic it is and how great it is. And Jesus said, there'll not be one rock or stone left upon the other. Now, in Matthew, it says His disciples asked Him. But in Mark, it says that it was Peter, James, and John that called Him apart and said, in here, look at this temple. And so He was actually talking to them then at that time. Then in John 13 and verse 23, it's talking about the Last Supper. When Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, when they were eating that, they were all reclining. And they didn't sit at tables back in that time. They would have a couch. They'd have a semicircle couch. And people would lay down on the couch and lay up on their arm like this, and they would eat. And so if you could imagine the couch going around like this, and it comes back around and comes around here. Now, here I am, and so I'm eating. Well, the guy behind me, I've got to turn around and talk to like this. The one in front of me, I don't have to do that. And the one in front of you is generally the place of honor. And this is where John's describing it, and he says, now the disciple whom Jesus loved. By the way, John never uses his name in his gospel. He uses the name of all the other disciples, all the other apostles. He tells about them, but his name is conspicuously left out. And this is one of the great reasons why people say undoubtedly John, Apostle John, had to be the author, is because he didn't call attention to himself. He talked about all the others except him. Then in chapter 19 of John, when he's on the cross, why, he looked down and he committed his mother into the hands of John the Apostle. Out of all the others, he chose John to take care of his mother. So you have a relationship then that is in there. And John had a very special, close relationship to Jesus, so much so that it could say he's the one that Jesus loved. Now, his personal life, as you look at John, he was the son of Zebedee and Salome. Now, his mother attended to Jesus and his disciples. She followed them around, and she attended to them as only a woman could do in providing the daily necessities and so forth that they needed. There's verses that show about this. This would indicate, as other things, this would indicate that she had some financial freedom. She had the freedom to follow them around and be able to provide their needs in there. Then the other thing is that John owned property, and he hired employees. In Mark 1:20, when Jesus called them, why it says he left, and then he gave the job that they were all doing. They were cleaning fish nets. He gave that to his servants. So evidently, John was and his family, and I don't want to leave a wrong impression here. I don't want to say they were rich, but they were probably the richest of all of the apostles, because these two things let us know they were a person of some financial means in there. Then another thing about him, he was known to Caiaphas, the high priest. In John the 18th chapter and verse 15, we're told that he knew Caiaphas. Now, Caiaphas was the high priest, and when a person was a friend of the high priest, so much so that he could have access to the courtyard. And you remember, John is the one that they let in because of his friendship with Caiaphas. Then his social standing was pretty high. So evidently John, in the physical world, had a higher status than these others. Now, John did take Jesus into his own home. He took her in there, and the tradition tells us, history tells us, that he kept her in his own home for 15 years before she died. But he was that kind of an individual. Then again, tradition tells us that John was the youngest of the apostles. When the 12 were chosen, he would have been the youngest. But he was the oldest of the apostles when he died. And he was the only one that wasn't martyred. John was evidently somewhere around 90. And this is a guess, what it's there. When you say, okay, what do you mean a guess? Okay, we know how old Jesus was when he started preaching. How old was he? He was 30. How old were his apostles when he called them? When he went along and called these different men? Well, they were different ages, weren't they? Obviously, they were different ages. Do you suppose he called any 75-year-old guys to send them out to go out and preach for the next 25, 30 years? Do you suppose he called 15-year-old boys? So you say, well, I don't have any idea how old they were, but Jesus was 30 when he started out preaching, so probably somewhere in that vicinity. This is when Jews began to look at males as real men at 30 years of age. And so we're just guessing that John was somewhere around that age. And then if he wrote his last book somewhere in the 90s, why, then he would have been about 90 years old when he died. But that's something we don't know for sure. Now, the characteristics of John. What about him? What kind of a guy was he? It's always interesting to take a look at the writers of the Bible, to just stop and before you go in reading their book, try to get acquainted with them. Let's suppose that we had the writers of the Bible, all of the writers, all the authors, they all here, and they were sitting here tonight in this building. Every one of them would be a different person, wouldn't they? They'd all have a different personality. They'd all be a different person. They'd all look differently. Now, the one thing that they would all have in common is that total dedication to God. You find this is through in all of them, just a total dedication. But we're not talking about their total dedication to God. We're talking about what's their life like? What did they enjoy? What kind of an individual were they? And as you go back and you study in the Old Testament, you find guys back there like Isaiah. And undoubtedly Isaiah was he's called the Prince of the Prophets. He was very dignified. He was in the house of the king. He was the king's Secretary of State. He was the king's advisor. He lived there with the king over in Babylon, and he was advising him of various things, or it'd be over in Assyria. And so he was advising him in various things. His writings, very dignified writings. When you go to a guy like Amos, Amos describes himself, and he said, I wasn't a prophet nor the son of a prophet. That is, I'm not trained in speaking. He said, I was a dresser of sycamore trees. In other words, he was out and he was a guy that had an orchard of sycamore trees of very poor quality fruit is what that was. And so he was a poor farmer is what he said. And he said, the only reason I'm here is that God told me, you go and you do this and you do that. Well, when Amos preached, you can just see the fire coming out. You can see that he doesn't try to be dignified in any way. He just lays it down, and he said, here's what it is, here's what you've done. And so he was a preacher of that character. When you look at Hosea, you look at Hosea as a man, passionate man, a man that was called upon to take a wife who left him and committed adultery and broke his heart, and he's a different kind of individual. Now they both preached at the same time, but Hosea was a person, due to his status of life, of where he was a man that preached with a broken heart, and he was pleading with people as a man who understood what a broken heart is. He understood what it was like to have his wife to leave him and go out and become a harlot in town. And then she wanted to come back to him. And God said, now you take her back. He understood the agony and the turmoil that went on. So God used him to go out and preach then to Israel and tell Israel, that's what you are. You have played the harlot. You have left God. You have broken God's heart. And God all this time is pleading for you to come back. And He's willing to take you back. And so he talks with that broken heart and that pleading that he has. While all the time Amos is talking to the people and telling them, you have departed from God, and God said, and you... And so they're two separate individuals that are there. You look at people, and you look at David, and you say, well, how would you describe him? Well, we'll not take time to describe him. Most of us are very well acquainted with David and know how he was a very spiritual-minded boy from his youth up, and how dedicated he was, and so forth and so on. He was a musician and a poet and so forth. So you look at these guys. If they're all sitting there, they're all different, and you get to knowing them as a person instead of just a name of a book. That what kind of a person are these particular individuals? And as you look at them, they become very, very meaningful. You kind of then look at them as a friend that's there. Now, when you move into the New Testament, right, out of the apostles, most of them we don't know really anything about. We don't know what kind of individuals they are. We know a little bit about Thomas. About the only thing we know about Thomas is that he was a person that says, I'll not believe it unless I see it. In other words, he wanted the facts laid out before him. But what kind of was he? Matthew, he was a tax collector. You can say, well, for a person to be a tax collector, they have to be a certain kind of an individual. See? And so you can kind of look at it maybe just a little bit like that. But you don't know. You don't know very much about these guys. When you come to Peter, though, you learn a lot, don't you? You know a whole lot. And so in our last year, we studied about Peter and about him. And what an interesting individual that Peter really is. And how the Lord would have looked at him and been attracted to him. And he had these characteristics of rock solid, immovable, but yet he had that characteristic of being impetuous and jumping in before he should have jumped in. Then you come to John. Now there's quite a lot we know about John. And the other one, of course, would be Paul. And everybody studied him a lot. We know him as a scholarly individual, a boy that was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel in the city of Jerusalem and learned the law and advanced in the law that they had there in the Sanhedrin, and very scholarly, and has written all of those scholarly books. But John, we can pick out some things about John. What kind of an individual was he? Well, an interesting thing is in Luke chapter 9 verse 54, when they were going down to Jerusalem one time, going from the Sea of Galilee down to Jerusalem, they met the Samaritans, and the Samaritan says, "We'll not let you pass through our land," because they didn't want anybody going to Jerusalem, and said, if you're going to Jerusalem, you can't pass through our land. That's where James and John, the two brothers, turned around and they asked the Lord, "Lord, do you want us to call lightning out of heaven and just destroy these people?" Now I want you to think about that for just a moment, because it's kind of easy to read it. When you read it through, why it says, and they turned to Jesus and said, "Shall we call lightning out of heaven and destroy them?" But when you put it in real context, what kind of an individual would he be? Now, here it is. You have these 12 people. These Samaritans are meeting them. The Samaritans won't let them pass. And so John just jumped in and says, "Do you want us to call lightning out of heaven and we'll just..." Here, Jesus told, "No, just let them go." So John and James and John have been called the sons of thunder. That they were just willing to, take the bull by the horn and really do something about that. Now, at another time, right about that same time, he was one of the guys that met those other people who were out and they were teaching about Jesus. They were teaching John the Baptist doctrine. They were apostles of his. And so John saw them and he forbade them. He said, "Don't you teach anymore." In other words, you're not one of the 12. You're not with us. And so you quit teaching. Well, he was as wrong as he could be, and Jesus corrected him and says, "No, that's not true. Those men are faithful men that are out there." But that's not our point. Our point is, what do you learn about John, his characteristics, see, his personality? When he's saying, if you're not going to be one of the 12 and going along with us, you just knock it off. You're not going to be preaching. See? So you look at him and you say, "Wow, okay, he's that kind of an individual." Now, he and James one time, they came up to the Lord before the other people got a chance, and they requested, "Could you give us positions in the kingdom? Let one of us sit on your left hand, one of us sit on your right hand." Could we do that? And that's where the Lord said, "No, I can't do that." And their mother asked the Lord again to do this. But when they did it, the other disciples got mad at them. And in other words, the other disciples looked at him, "You're jumping the gun, you're selfish, you're trying to get this for your own self." Well, it kind of fits his personality in there of that situation that we've seen in these other two things that are there. Now, when he wrote his letters in 1st and 2nd John, why, he became very, very dogmatic in various things. Evidently, John, should be a capital, he had a strong and fiery nature, is what this guy says about him. What he did is that he would call him a liar and a murderer. In other words, if you don't keep the commands of God and you say you love God, you're a liar. And he just laid it out. And if you don't love your brother, you're a murderer. And so he was very harsh in his preaching. But the interesting thing is, what do you know about John? How do you think of John? You don't think of him in any of the ways I've talked about tonight, do you? When you think about John. There's one word that comes up. What is that one word? Love. It's love. He's apostle of love. Mixed in with all of this teaching down here, of where he says you're a liar and you're a murderer and you're a false teacher, and you are the Antichrist, and he just condemns them. All mixed in there is that pleading with love, of how we're to love one another. And he's known as the apostle of love. That's the reason I've taken this out of this guy's comment here that I think is a very good one. He talks about John was a man of this fiery nature, this intense feelings, but he was sweetened down by the love of Christ and guided by the Holy Spirit. So Jesus took this son of thunder, this man that wanted to call fire out of heaven, the man that says, if you're not with us, you're not going to be able to teach, and he turned him in to a person with a very dogmatic personality, but one of a sweet personality, talking about love. Now, John lived in Jerusalem. We can find that out by studying about Paul and when they were all there and when Paul left and he went up. We're not going to go into those details tonight. And so he came back and he found John was still at Jerusalem. So Paul left for a few more years and he came back, and then John was gone. And James was there, but John was gone. And so John had moved to Ephesus. That's where all of history tells us that he went up there, and he lived in Ephesus then. And his final words, we're told, by those who knew of him. And by the way, John lived up into the 90s. And then there was another guy by the name of Polycarp. And Polycarp knew John. John had converted this guy by the name of Polycarp. And so there's a direct connection between the Apostle John and this individual. And so it's said that in John's old age, that as he grew elderly and evidently up in his 90s, that he walked with a cane and he would come into the services, and out of honor they'd always ask him, do you want to say something to them? And he would always stand up and say the same thing they said. Little children, love one another. And they ask him, they say, why do you always say that that's in there? I don't have it down there. Why do you always say this? You just say the same thing over and over and over again. And he said, because that is what our Lord said for us to do. And in fact, if we do that, then everything else will fall in line. Love one another. That's there. And in fact, isn't that what Jesus taught? What are the two great commandments? Love God, love your neighbor. And then what does he say about every other commandment? They're built around those two things, see. And so then we have him there. So he went from a son of thunder to an apostle of love because he had been with Jesus. So we can't help but love this old man and some things he gave us. Now, the characteristics of John's gospel. What will we find as we study in his gospel? Now, John covers the life of Christ primarily from the Judean ministry. Now, the synoptics view it from the Galilean ministry. Let's talk about that word just a minute. What do I mean by the synoptics? You read about the synoptic gospel, and that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And synoptics, well, we know what synonyms mean, don't we? I mean, it comes from the same root. It means same as. Synoptics are the gospels that are very much alike. They cover the same material. Now, when you're talking about the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're not saying that they all cover exactly the same, but they cover almost the same. When you find a story in Matthew, you'll generally find it either in Mark or in Luke in there. But now, the Gospel of John, not so. Very, very little that you find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that you'll find in John. It's totally different material. And the reason for that is John tells about his life down in Judea, when Jesus would go down to Judea. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke would tell about his life up here in Galilee. Now, Jesus did most of his preaching up in Galilee. That's where he would do most of his preaching. He did preaching when he went down to Judea, and he would go down there and he would meet the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they would attack him when he went down on the feast days, and so there'd be a lot of argumentation, and of course that's where he was put to death. That was down there. But this is the reason why that as you're studying Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll find they talk about the same things. But when you study about John, he doesn't. There's only a couple things that he really talks about that's the same. Now, another difference between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is the synoptics deal with the kingdom, and John deals with the king. And that is a big difference. His in the book of Matthew, how many times will you read "and the kingdom of heaven"? Just over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So it's about the kingdom. But now John is going to be dealing with the king. He's going to be dealing with Jesus. And he's going to be doing it then in a little different way. Here's an interesting thing. The synoptics view it from the viewpoint of human becoming divine. And John deals with the viewpoint of the divine becoming human. In a minute, I'll come back to this and show you at another chart in here. But what I mean by this is that when you start out with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you start out with them in a situation, well, Mark doesn't deal with the birth, but Matthew and Luke does. You start out with them, and they tell you about a little baby being born upon this earth. A little baby. Here is a little human baby born on this earth. And then they start telling you about this little baby, how this little baby grew up, and how he became then, at age 30, one who went out and preached, and what he did, and then how he proved himself to be deity. And so they take him from the human viewpoint and develop the story and finally show he was divine. But when we turn over to John, John's not going to talk about him being born as a human. He's going to start right out immediately with him being deity. He was deity, and he came down to this earth. And so they look at it from two different ways. It's exactly the same story, but they look at it from two different ways. So John is going to be different than that. Now, the Gospel of John gives us the 7 I ams of Jesus. 7 times Jesus said, "I am." And he made a statement, "I am something." And when you look at this and the claims that he has, just think what this means. I am the bread of life. You eat me, you'll have life. I am the light of the world. If you want to know what to do, you want to walk in light, you follow me. I am the door. If you want to come to God, you will pass through me. I am the good shepherd. If you want to be sheep that's pleasing to God, you must put yourself under my control because I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection of life. I am. If you want to be raised from the dead, you want to live eternally, you're going to do it through me. I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. He doesn't leave any viewpoint any other than he is these things. I am the vine. So you look at the vine, the trunk of the tree, and you are the branches. So I am the vine. And then he shows, if you want to have life, you have to stay connected to me. If a branch is severed from me, you don't have any life. You're going to die. So he'll make it very plain, that showing that he is deity. Now then we ask, to whom did John write when he wrote these letters? Well, you look at Matthew, and you see Matthew was doing two things. He was constantly quoting the Old Testament. He was constantly saying, as it is written. The kingdom of heaven, so as it is written, as it is written. Well, who would have the knowledge to be able to understand as it is written? See? It's only the Jews. Now, Mark wrote to Gentiles, and his writing is same stories, but he doesn't constantly say as it is written, and he'll make statements to explain certain things to let you know he's writing to Gentiles. Luke wrote to Gentiles and the Roman world. There, he would explain a lot of things. John's gospel is universal in nature, and it's to the entire world for all time. It's a story about Jesus, not just to Jews, not to any particular group. You can't pinpoint it down anywhere. It's a universal gospel to everybody. Now, we've got this is obvious because of his many explanatory notes to Jewish customs and places. If he was writing to, if somebody was writing a letter about Monroe, and they were writing the letter to us people who live in Monroe, would they spend a lot of time describing Monroe? When they'd say, now, if you go down to the police station and turn to the right, so they wouldn't say, and the police station is located on Main Street and it's on the south side. They wouldn't start telling us these things. They would expect, yeah, we know these various things. John, he's going to explain many things about the Jewish customs. When they had a custom, then he'll say, this is what this means, showing that it really wasn't written to the Jewish world. Now, the outline of the book, the way you'd outline it, an outline of a book, especially this book, is really not that important. But the way it's outlined in here generally is chapters 1 through 12 is revealing himself in various ways. He's going to be showing the world what he is. 1 through 6, he reveals himself in ever-widening circles. He just starts out with the disciples, then he goes bigger, 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 and so he's revealing himself and letting people see what he's doing and who he is. In chapters 7 through 10, there you have his sermons. And he was down at the Feast of Tabernacles and the Feast of Dedication. And so he's down in Judea. Of course, we said this is where John is going to be giving us his life from. But here's going to be some sermons, his discourses that are down there. 11 and 12, he reveals himself by two mighty deeds, Lazarus and the triumphal entry. So he's going to show two great things here that he does, and that's the resurrection of Lazarus and the triumphal entry. Now, 11 and 12, and here, I should have, there's a, well, maybe I did it right and think of doing it wrong. I took this out of Tenney's outline there. But in 11 and 12, he's revealing himself in various ways to the multitudes that's there, and he does that with those two great things up there. Now, 13 through 21, in there, he withdraws back into the circle of his disciples, and he has these events and discourse in the upper room there in the 13 through 17. In chapters 18 and 19, you have the story of the death of Christ, and then chapters 20 and 21, his resurrection and his appearance. So these are things that's going to happen down in the Judean ministry. The way this guy outlines his actions is another way of putting it. And these are not things to remember in here, but it's kind of interesting and looking, kind of see what you know the book is about. He points out the first section in here is a period of consideration of where these things are given and people are to consider what he has to say. Then he moves into a period of controversy, where there's a lot of controversy surrounding him. Then he moves into a period of conflict, where there's actual conflict that is taking place. And then what he calls crisis. It gets down to the crisis times of what Jesus is going to do. Is he going to continue on the same path that he's on and come headlong with those Sadducees that are in Jerusalem? It's come to a crisis, or will he back up in there? Of course, we know he didn't. Period of conference where he does some talking then with them. And a period of consummation. This is where he's ending his life in there. And then the epilogue, that is, after his life is over, then talking about those things in chapter 21. So, as you see, the outline, don't even try to remember it, because you'll see as you go along what these things are. And these guys just try to show us somehow that you can put it in a little bit of an outline form, but it's not really important in there. Okay, I goofed up this one right here. I'm not going to be able to see this whole thing that's here. Just a minute. We'll just leave it like that, speed it up. Okay, now we'll be able to see it here. I think that's the one that we were on, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay, back in business. Now, the purpose of the gospel then. What do we find as we're really studying this and looking at it? John tells his purpose in writing. He said, "Many other signs, therefore, did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." Now, there's a very concise way of putting it. This is the purpose of my writing. And if you try to find any other purpose in it, well, it's just not going to be there. Now, first of all, we're going to draw out signs. Many other signs. Miracles are called signs, and they're called wonders there. And they're called a sign because it is a miraculous event of where nature is superseded. You take nature as it is, and you just turn it upside down or turn it backwards. It doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Somebody who is doing these signs has power over nature, of where they can just take control of nature and turn it upside down. Well, everybody knows only God would be able to do that. So if an individual is coming along and he's preaching something, and he then is able to take nature and turn it upside down, that is a sign. It's a sign of what? That God is with him. See? God is not going to be with an individual and permit that individual to do that if that individual is teaching a lie. In fact, Jesus had told us that in one place. So it's a sign. It's a sign that this person is telling the truth. This person you can believe because it is a sign from heaven. These miracles are. Now, as you look at the miracles that you find in John, first of all, he changes water into wine. Now, there we would say is a miracle of quality, of what it is. He's upgrading it from water into wine. He heals the nobleman's son. He did this at a distance. He wasn't even there. He just said, "You go back home and he'll be healed." He healed an impotent man, a man that didn't have any strength. He couldn't walk. That's in there. He'd been this way all of his life, about 40 years. And so it shows time means nothing to him. He fed the 5,000. There's quantity, showing how there's just no limit of how he can take these little fishes and a loaf of bread and do this. Then he walking on water. He has control of nature. And then healing the man born blind. That is misfortunes of life. He can take them and turn them all around. And then raising of Lazarus. He has power over death. And so you find these miracles that's here. Now here's an interesting thing. Here are your two miracles that you find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so this will be the two things. Now, by the way, the resurrection of Christ is also found in all four Gospels. The resurrection, his death, burial, and resurrection. But as far as the stories are concerned, here are the only two really that are that you find in the other synoptic Gospels that are there. So here are the signs that you have that you may believe. So you see these things, and you see, yes, this individual has to be telling the truth. He has to be who he is because he has the power over all nature, all of the universe. He has that power. And if you believe in him, then you may have life through his name. And that is eternal life. So John says that's what it's all about, is to write this down, show you what he did, show you what he did, so that you can believe, and from the point of believing, you then can have life. Now, he closes his book by saying this. This is the disciple that beareth witness of these things, and wrote these things, and we know that his witness is true. John is saying in that verse, he's saying, I saw them with my own eyes, so I know they are the truth. This is not hearsay. This is something that I have seen. Then he tells about Jesus. He said, and there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. So I suppose if I told you everything Jesus did, the world itself wouldn't hold them. So he said, I'm just pointing out these things so you'll understand that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, the introduction to Jesus in Matthew and Luke, there's a story. You just see it by the picture, and you know about it. A little baby born in a cradle, and he grew up and showed himself to be divine. But now, the introduction of Jesus by John is a totally different thing. Here it is. He's going to start out. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Without him was not anything made that hath been made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness apprehendeth it not. Quite an introduction as we look at all these things. Then he goes ahead and he says, now there was a man by the name of John that God sent. And then he shows John introduced the world to Jesus, but John wasn't the Christ. Jesus was the Christ. Then he's going to go ahead and he's going to say, now he was the true light, and this and this and this and this, and going to go ahead talking about these things in this way. So that's where we'll begin this next week, talking about in the beginning, we'll start right out, Jesus. And the point I want to make is, the way John starts, Jesus was in heaven and he came to earth. So kind of think of it this way. Seeing Jesus being divine is an awesome thing. It's a thing that just causes you to gasp. Now, if you're reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you see a little baby that's born. And then all of a sudden you start seeing things around that little baby. You see angels, you see this, you see that, and you, wow, and then he grows up, wow, and whew, and you just gasp that Jesus is Christ. But now then, as you read John now is gasping that look at who he is. Wow, he's deity, and he came down here. Wow, woo. Matthew, Mark, Luke is, look, a human. Wow, he is in there. So he's just looking at it from two different viewpoints. But next week, we'll start out then with the text itself. Okay, class dismissed.